Thank you for getting my title change. I'll say a little bit about how the sovereignty of the senses, which was after the subtitle in a lot of the publicity, morphed into this other title, Feeling Bad Now. Actually a simpler title, so one that perhaps needs less explanation. Thank you, Slavcho, for the introduction and also for bringing me here finally for the summer school after various kinds of exchanges that you and I have had back and forth, and also that I've had with other folks who are part of the ipak.center. So also to Stanimir, to Elizaveta, to others who've made it possible for me to be here this time around to build on at this point, a kind of ongoing relationship over time. And I want to mark that because I see some people in the audience who haven't been with us this week. So thank you for coming, especially on a very hot Saturday evening in Belgrade. I thought I was leaving behind the heat of Texas to come here, but apparently not. And instead, floods are happening in my home. And I had a trip to Belgrade I had to cancel because of the floods that you had here 3 years ago. So yeah, if political depression doesn't get us, climate change will. And so here we are together. In fact, it seems better to be inside in some air conditioning than to be outside right now. So thank you for your attention. And I've had a great time this week with the provocation and attention of the students who are enrolled in the summer program. So in thinking about my remarks for this evening, I had to consider both what would be new, especially late in this intensive week we've had, but also ways that I could take advantage of the discussions we've been having. So for those of you who are just showing up now, welcome, and I hope to be able to bring you into a conversation we have been having. So just a few threads that I want to pick up on from earlier in the week. We've been, I think, wanting to take up quite a bit. I have to look at some notes I made to myself. Hang on. One of the threads really came up for me in the work that Borjana Rasa introduced us to through both the performance work last night and the discussion this morning about political demonstrations, and particularly the bodily performance of the self, particularly the gendered and the sex self, in the public sphere. So that's been one frame for me, is thinking about protest, thinking about public gatherings, and I think you'll see that that's a piece of the work that I'm presenting here as well. I also had suggested in part of a conversation we had, because we did a writing workshop together on Wednesday, and one of the questions that came up was about what the value can be of people sharing their thoughts, their writings, their feelings, once those feelings, thoughts, writings, words proliferate. So how do we bring that together? So I want to keep that also as a question. I'm not sure I can answer it, but I want to continue to circulate it as something that is a frame for the work that I'm presenting tonight. And then I also want to go back to the discussion we had on Tuesday morning with Lisa Blackman, who very kindly engaged with some of my work on depression. And we had, I thought, a very interesting discussion, one that's been very much on my mind, and that is also, I think, a frame for my remarks this evening, which is Slavcho is also referencing this in his introduction, the relation between clinical or medical approaches to depression and mental health and political or cultural approaches. And as I have continued to think about my book on depression, which makes a very strong argument for a political analysis of depression, one that's quite present in this handout here, this project I did with the Berlin-based artist Karen Michalski called The Alphabet of Feeling Bad. I also experience, as I think we all should or do if we're honest about our intellectual work, certain kinds of ambivalence or pushback around what it means to critique the medical model, particularly for people who feel that that is an important dynamic for them or gives them access to resources and so on. So we had an interesting discussion of that I also want to keep on the table for for this evening. Also around, I think as I said then, it's been easier for me to present on the recent work I've been doing on archives and harder for me to present on whatever the aftermath or the after depression might be. And it's a kind of play on words to have the depression in italics here, so it does mean just the title of my book, but I do mean you to hear, what comes after depression. And I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, and it feels that we have established enough intimacy in our conversations that it might be possible for me to present work that's really still unsure of itself with respect to what the scholarly work might be. And I'll tell you now, maybe to put it in the simplest possible form, one question would be, how are we feeling now, and in what ways are we feeling bad now? I'll come at the end to the question of whether political depression might or might not be the best way to describe at least the way I'm feeling now. But it is also true that, especially because some people say, oh, you write about negative affect all the time, what about, what about pleasure, joy, positive affect, and so on? And definitely in the back of my mind, or sometimes in the front, is the desire to write something that would be about how to feel better. And I'm not sure if that's an academic project. I'm not sure, how to write it, how to do it. So again, perhaps you're going to experience me in a certain version of the impasse that I write about. It's certainly been, for me at least, a pretty difficult couple of years politically and in my workspace. I'll talk about that a bit in the final section of the paper. So that's my kind of preamble that aims to suggest how I would like to use this time frame. I feel like I've gotten a lot of time already, but to use this one as we start to wind up, we have just one more day together tomorrow to be thinking about some of the different conversations that we have been having across the week, and to open that conversation to some people who've arrived perhaps for the first time this evening. Okay, if nothing else, I hope there'll be some good pictures for you to look at. So just looking back to the Depression, A Public Feeling book, one consistent starting point for me when I present that work and when I think about my work going forward is the collaboration with artists. And I've been really happy at how central that has been to our work this week. I don't know if it's always true for the summer school, but certainly you seem to have chosen strategically both the students and the guests this time. So it feels like that needs no explanation, or that people would be quite comfortable with, say, the claim that Borjana was making this morning about art being not only practice but theory, or a way of building knowledge. My work has so often come out of collaborations with artists. Two of the artists who were central to my thinking in the Depression Project were Alison Mitchell with her project The Hungry Purse, and also Sheila Pepe with a project called Common Sense that's had a number of different iterations. And I would say that these two projects, I think maybe this one is the best, are I would call craft-based installations, and they are immersive environments that people can get inside to literally produce new feelings as both affect and emotion, but especially material forms of touch and sensation. So already right away, I think we come to some of the interests that we share as a group. Many people who've mentioned being interested in affect studies and also interested in new materialisms, new understandings of sensation. And I'm happy to see that those keywords in the 5 years since this book was published have only grown more prominent in the critical scene. These feelings from installation or immersion form the basis, arguably, for new kinds of collectivity, or what Sheila Pepe says, describes as common sense, what I would describe as an affective rather than a rational public sphere, where embodied experience is the ground for forms of sociality that are shared rather than individualized. In writing about these projects, but more precisely thinking and feeling alongside these artists with whom I've had ongoing relationships, and I think that's important too, is the establishment of the direct relationships with artists as fellow travelers. I think that's also something that we have been doing with each other this week. I have found myself ruminating on embodied and affective methods. I want to underscore that my thinking emerged from the process of actually being in and interacting with the spaces these artists created, and hence a form of affective engagement that was sensuous, embodied, and tactile. Thinking becomes a practice of engaging with the material world, of feeling and touching both people and things. You saw us do that very much with collections of objects from which we wrote a couple of days ago. And I also suggest that this encounter with the material world in the form of both objects and things, or human and non-human environments, is one way, in the words of my book, to make room for crazy thoughts to become realities. That's a phrase that I use, which is intended to be, to run the risk of a kind of mental health oppression, right? To use the word crazy, or but to actually reclaim that word in a kind of mad pride. So again, some of you will remember seeing that picture of the bibliographic altar as a practice of bringing together what might seem like disparate or slender archives, resources, materials, feelings, in order to make some kind of academic project. In the wake of the publication of Depression, I seem to keep collecting art projects that are spatial environments as one way of continuing to work on affect. I've been particularly fortunate to have some of the book's arguments put into creative and material form through two different video installations called The Alphabet of Feeling Bad. And you actually, now I am able to give you one version of it in this handout that I hope you have. But it began as a performance of theory in this setting that is homage to Tracy Emin's bed. And then there was also, so it was displayed as actually part of an exhibition that was called An Unhappy Archive, an homage to, or borrowing from Sara Ahmed, in which the film that came out of my performance was also displayed alongside of books and other materials. It's kind of fun to see your own book as a material object included as part of an art exhibition. And then the second version of the piece was just the text, which was screened on a wall of ice in northern Sweden, in Umeå, and then also in the more intimate space of a hotel room where viewers could lie on the bed and watch the video projected onto the ceiling. I've been happy to see my ideas circulate in this way, along with those of my fellow queer feminist affect theorists, to be the occasion for people to respond to the work affectively, spatially, and collectively through embodied encounters and transformations of public space. And then what you have now is actually a version of an audio version in LP form. So a record was created of the audio file, and it was made into this beautiful package called An Unhappy Archive that features Sara Ahmed's feminist killjoy piece, an archive of images from the exhibition. And of course, again, those of you who know my work on archive would appreciate that I'm very happy with the more analog format of the EP, which is making a comeback now in audio world, and which also then does leave room in a way that digital formats often don't for text to be combined and image to be combined with the audio files. So the text of the piece is part of the sleeve for the album. So it's had all of these different material iterations as a way of circulating that work. I can speak to it more. I have a longer piece on it, but I just wanted to present that as one kind of example. And then what I want to spend a bit more time on is two other works that have been important to me. One, which is called Breastival Vestibule, which is a series of pop-up inflatables by Rachel Shannon that has the same craft-based tactility of the Sheila Pepe and Allison Mitchell projects that were featured in the Depression book. And then also, and we've been talking about her as well in my other work, Zoe Leonard's Camera Obscura project, which came up when we were talking about archives earlier. And so I'm happy to have a chance to elaborate a bit further on this newer work as it plugs into my thinking about affect. Zoe's an artist who has been my fellow traveler for quite some time. And although the Camera Obscura project has a different kind of feeling or materiality because it's not using craft, it also, I would argue, is interested in how attention to sensory experience, in this case especially vision, might produce new kinds of democracy and collectivity. In attending to the forms of embodied and sensory experience that they enable, I have found these installations productive for a project I've been calling The Sovereignty of the Senses. So that was the original title of my talk, which seeks to articulate liberation in sensory and affect affective rather than narrowly political terms. The phrase emerged in the context of the Depression book, where I used the term felt sovereignty to describe crafting's potential to create a different relation between mind and body than that conventionally understood by the term sovereignty. A process of, these were my words, not of exercising control over the body and senses, but instead of recovering them from the mind's control or integrating them with it. And I just have been, again, I like to be transparent, and I think sometimes it is possible in a live encounter, especially if you're with people with whom you have some history, to just try to admit the difficulties in the process. So I've just been meditating on this phrase, sovereignty of the senses, this issue of the relation between mind and body, and sometimes spinning around, just trying to figure out what does that mean, and continuing to unpack it. I know what I'm what I'm aiming to do. I know what the question or the project is, just not sure what the vocabulary would be. So the term signals a desire to articulate notions of sovereignty as well as democracy and freedom as an embodied practice rather than an abstract concept, and as something that must be learned and experienced over time and collectively rather than as a fixed or final condition of a sovereign or discrete individual. However, I do use the term sovereignty with some critical trepidation, mindful of Lauren Berlant's characterization of it as, quote, a militaristic and melodramatic view of individual agency. But I'm also seeking to engage with the contested but lively use of the term in Indigenous theory and politics. By placing sovereignty alongside the senses, I hope to give it a queer reorientation, to engage with concepts such as Berlant's good life or Ahmed's happiness by asking how it feels, with the understanding, as the critique suggests, that we don't always know, that we can't always trust our feelings or our senses. So yeah, I'm still not sure if I will stick with the term, but I am interested in the way that it's a site of theoretical tension. I'm thinking also of the way in which more recently Berlant and Edelman in Sex or the Unbearable really work with the issue of a kind of non-sovereignty of the self, or a loss of control. And I find that very sympathetic to that, while also being interested in this kind of vernacular category of what does it mean to trust your feelings. So one of my watchwords is the Whitney Houston song, "How Will I Know That He Really Loves Me?" And there's that kind of line that's either, I always hear it wrong, or I'm still not sure whether it's "don't trust your feelings" or "just trust your feelings." That's the little chorus. And I think it's important that it could be either. I'm also thinking here about the work of Audre Lorde on the question of what it means to access feeling beyond the oppressive apparatus of certain kinds of framing of feeling and knowledge, thinking too about affect theory's invitation to focus on the public sphere as embodied, not just rational, which has given us new understandings of utopia and the commons, such as Rancière and Nancy on the aesthetics and sensations of being with others, Jose Munoz on the brown commons, or Fred Moten and Stefano Harney on the undercommons. Another way of describing my project is that I'm still trying to figure out, this is like 30 years or more of my work as a scholar, still trying to figure out what it means to be in the body, to continue the work of undoing Cartesian dissociative splits between mind and body, which are lived not just conceptually but materially. Where are we now with the question of trauma and healing, both problematic terms that have been central to my work? What is a somatic therapy, a somatic politics? What is a radical democracy that can account for the body? I'm interested in the full range from biopolitics to more alternative discourses and practices of healing, understood at a variety of scales, both micro, not just individuals, but cells or units of matter, such as vitality, and macro, collective or social entities. In the wake of the affective turn, as well as new materialisms, which vastly complicate the relation between body and brain, or spirit and matter, what is a body politics? So that's the theoretical frame. I think it's one that I share with a lot of you. I think many of you are coming at this from your particular generational position. Reading this right now, I'm actually reminded of Katerina's lecture on Tuesday evening, in which we were talking about philosophy as a discipline and what it can give us by way of a body politics. And I see that this work now is a response to having begun my intellectual career in philosophy and feeling I had to flee it in order to do what I want to do. So I think my turn to artists represents the sort of long-range response to that of, who do I want to be in dialogue with. But I think I was probably kind of damaged by philosophy, at least as it was practiced in the Anglo-American Academy in the late 70s, where there just really was not a lot of space for thinking about feeling or the body. Okay, so back to the artists. Let's talk a little bit about Zoe Leonard. So this project, the Camera Obscura series, which she's recreated this simple technology of the camera obscura in a range of different locations, actually beginning with locations in Europe and then eventually some in the US as well. The project invokes not only the early history of photography, but the history of sense perception to stage a slow encounter with what it means to sense and feel the world, and how to build from there to a different notion of democracy in the public sphere, one based in an understanding of cognitive experience as sensory. And in fact, one way I've sometimes presented this work, this would go back to our writing workshop experience, is just to, I have a little personal narrative, I'm not going to read it here, of sitting in this version of the camera obscura in the Camden Arts Centre in London in 2012, and trying to just describe what I was seeing, just trying to write, like, I see this crane, I see this sign, what does the room feel like, as a way of trying to engage with the work and think about what it means. I do respond to Leonard not just sensorially, but as a theorist. And indeed, I do think it may be the mark of a certain kind of queer sensibility. This might be something for us to think about as a group, to draw inspiration from the dense transfers of meaning that happen when ideas are rendered material through the media of video, photographs, and visual art. Installation is especially rich in this respect. It creates spaces and environments that facilitate new forms of embodied experience, including feelings that take the form of moods and sensibilities rather than specific emotions, refusing stable boundaries between the interior and exterior of both self and space. It also creates new forms of collectivity and sociality. And I'm thinking too, because through Boriana's presentations, we're thinking about performance as a category that we might want to think about how installation and performance are interwoven together or share some of those same qualities. Zoe's Camera Obscura project has a particular thrill for me because of the way it speaks to Marx's famous reference to the camera obscura as a metaphor for ideology as the world turned upside down. I'm happy to be talking about Marx in Serbia. And it's another measure of, of a certain kind of training that I had in, at least when I was struggling with kind of Anglo-American philosophy, what was available were the tools of critical theory, post, or just sort of on the verge of post-structuralism, where there was barely yet, or there was a moment where there was no Derrida, Foucault, that was just like starting to be translated and circulated in the States. And so you studied Habermas, and you studied Hegel and Marx, and tried to figure out how to put the two of them together. I don't know if any of you share that genealogy, but I do. So I spent a long time with this concept in my early work on sensationalism, reading Marx against the grain in order to argue in what I now see as a proto-queer way that the fetish, or the attractions of the sensuous surface, should not be rejected, but could be a way to come to knowledge. So again, against the grain insofar as ideology as camera obscura was a way of dismissing ideology as a kind of false consciousness. Leonard's work not only affirms but enhances this reading of the camera obscura because she makes it possible to experience the source of the metaphor, to be able to see and feel this historical technology and the images it produces inside a site-specific material space. Once the fetish is reclaimed as both surface and material object, we can stop thinking of the camera obscura as producing a false image and instead reckon with the shimmering surface that encourages us to slow down, to watch and feel, and to experience watching as a feeling or sensation. In taking up the camera obscura, Leonard extends, for example, analogs. Let's see, where are we? I also talked about analog earlier in the week, so I just want to reference back, or for those of you who weren't with us earlier, just to mention the connection with this other project in which Leonard engages with early photography and the material specificity of the street. But now, so let's see, so here's a single image from analog of the street, and then here's another version of the street, which is now an image that is both ghostly and material. She has insisted that resurrecting this precursor to the photograph is not a nostalgic move, but rather a reminder that photography remains a point of view on the world, not a universal truth or realist document. And we were talking, I was mentioning earlier the way in which with her print photograph, she insists on the black frame being reproduced so that you understand it as a photograph or image, not a transparent access to what stands behind the image. So in her words, there is an important difference between saying, this is how it is, versus this is how I see it. I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't have it, I think, quite right. So this is how it is versus this is how I see it. The camera obscura's encouragement to pay attention to how seeing takes place renders standpoint epistemology literal. Leonard's camera obscura is also the work of someone whose sensibility was profoundly shaped by the AIDS crisis. AIDS activism drew from and created queer ways of seeing and being together. Attention to the everyday and slow time, the crafting of an appreciation for the present and for the sensory capacities of the body, is a sensibility that emerges from an attunement to the ephemerality of the present that can come from being in the presence of those who are sick or dying or living with ongoing loss. Perhaps Leonard's interest in the materiality of this is how I see it is also motivated by the need to imagine how others might see things too if they were still here. And so I wanted to just briefly reference this project that Leonard's activist collective Fierce Pussy did for an installation of the ACT UP Oral History Project at White Columns Gallery in New York in 2010, where they produced these slogans: if he were alive today, you'd be going dancing together. If he were alive today, he'd have his arms around you. So I want to link the camera obscura also to this project. Leonard's critique of mainstream documentary and insistence on point of view certainly comes as no surprise to anyone familiar with AIDS activist culture, especially practices of video making. But I think they can also be placed in the context of contemporary queer affect theory. The camera obscura reflects a desire to think about perception as embodied experience, as well as to historicize sensory experience by archiving technologies of seeing, such as the camera, that are linked to modernity. Zoe's desire to slow down the process of seeing, to ask us to notice everyday details and the mundane, contributes to a politics of affect that emerges from new ways of thinking about the senses. And this would also link to the discussions we've been having about how writing might build on these different understandings of sense perception that emerge in relation to different media. So what would it mean to take the slowing down and noticing that is made possible through the experience of the camera obscura, both with respect to vision and with respect to how your body is placed in the space? What would it mean to try to transfer that over to a process of writing that is attuned to the detail, the mundane, the everyday, and what new kinds of writing might that produce that could be part of our academic practice, as well as part of our critical practice that is taking up those forms of writing as we find them in the world, different alternative documentary practices, and trying to support them. The camera obscura links up the eye to the body, intervening in the process whereby vision has been disembodied through photographic technologies and images that float free from the circumstances of their production. It creates a sometimes disorienting and profoundly spatial form of seeing, an image projected onto a wall or space that affects one's ability to see the image, the sense of being inside a perceptual mechanism rather than simply holding onto a camera. It also keeps the field of vision diffuse, with no discernible punctum, or a ceaselessly shifting and idiosyncratic punctum, where we're not quite sure what we are supposed to see and have to work to pick out details or objects or events. The image is also non-reproducible. You can photograph it, I certainly did, but it doesn't have a fixed material status other than its wavering presence on the wall, ephemeral and constantly changing. In Leonard's rendition of it, the camera obscura also socializes vision. You have to be there to see it, and others have to be there too if you want to share the experience. To sit looking together in present time is to engage in the world in a different way. It interrupts the portability of the ubiquitous screens through which we mediate our relation to others. Like other queer installations that create built environments, the camera obscura aims to forge a commons or a radical democracy from live bodies, based in belief in the value of each person's embodied sense perception as the foundation for collective forms of witness that are multiple, partial, and affective. Rather than a rational public sphere of talking heads, such installations produce sensory bodies connected to one another and to the environment in unpredictable ways. And I think there's another connection here to conditions of activism and discussions of activism. I'm thinking of my own work and others on ACT UP, where there's an emphasis on the meeting and not just the demonstration as itself a gathering of bodies that has tremendous erotic energy, as well as also being freighted with questions of loss and mourning and grief. A queer politics of gender and sexuality is also a sensory politics, a way of making space not only for different kinds of bodies, but for different modes of perception. This would also be, I think, a space that's being very much opened up by disability studies and by notions of neurodiversity, notions of other forms of embodiment in the world, and what we can do with that also as a source of alternative information or ways of seeing. So a radical democracy of shared sensations is open-ended rather than fully achieved, and it is an ongoing practice to respond to feelings of impatience, discomfort, aggression, and checking out that collectivity regularly produces. The built environments provided by artists, but also activists, if we think about not just the ACT UP meetings I was describing earlier, but the Occupy movement, or even all of the different modes of demonstration that we were working with last night, are like experimental bubbles that provide a laboratory for checking in with ourselves and others. And I feel like that's also what we're trying to do in these kinds of gatherings. Okay, so there's more I can say about the different locations. The only, to the best of my knowledge, non-urban location where the camera obscura has been constructed was Marfa, Texas, which is this art town in the desert of Texas near me. It's a very interesting space and location. So I have been trying to think about the location of the camera obscura, and I could say more about that if people want in the Q&A. Let's see. I think in the interest of time, I knew this would happen. I'm going to squish my discussion of Rachel Shannon's breastable vestibule, partly just do it by virtue of the slides so that I can hopefully have about another 10 minutes to talk about feeling bad now and public feelings, because I think people will want to hear about that. So the breastable vestibule is a project that is what Shannon calls inflatable. So the idea is, and again, she's not alone in doing this, but I think her work helps to initiate a discussion of a lot of different kinds of art projects that are pop-ups, both literally and figuratively. That the inflatable technology is one that allows her to take this ripstop nylon and just a generator that blows air and create, so it's very portable, and then these spaces can be created virtually anywhere. So one of the first iterations was at Gay by Gay Gay in Austin, which is a local festival where people can meet and gather. The space is one that's really porous between inside and outside, and she also thinks of it as a kind of queer embodied space. So it's a really interesting space to talk about in terms of ideas about vitality, animacy, and the porousness of the human non-human, in that she's done a lot of work with costume, and especially with spandex and drag and modes of fabric that clothe the body, but also make the body into something that is queer, that is multiply gendered, and so on. So even though it's called breastable vestibule, it's also like has, it's kind of a body with many organs, let's say, and one that a body you can get inside of. So it's this animate structure that that I think reflects a lot of theoretical work that people are interested in around flat ontologies and new forms of sensation and being. It's also a space that can be both indoor and outdoor. So this is the Creating Change conference, where this is a very unusual thing to find in the middle of a bland conference hotel. It can be used for both retreat on an individual basis as well as for meetings. So here's an example of the kind of invitation that she's used in order to create this space inside of other larger collective gatherings, and again, enjoy an hour of relaxation meditation or come for conversation. So thinking about the difference between a discursive public space and something else. This is a recent version of it that was in Halifax in Canada, and interestingly enough, she ran into some problems with the fire marshals, who said that the space was not safe and that people couldn't go inside of it. And she, as often happens with these things, only discovered this, right as she was about to arrive, so there wasn't really an opportunity to negotiate or to make changes. So instead, what she did was to create these other inflatables outside of the space, and then to kind of work performatively with the way in which people engage with the spaces. And in an interesting loop or connection between my two projects, she took Zoe Leonard's I Want a Dyke for President, which was recreated in New York on the High Line in the context of the US presidential election last year. And so she put that text on this other inflatable object in order to try to extend the work to this outside space, given that people couldn't get inside of it. And it was kind of also she was in Canada, which was on the eve of its election, but also trying to reference the US election. So I guess an interesting kind of transnational dialogue being created there. So I hope that gives you just a little bit of a feel, as it were, for that project and this interest that many artists have. I'm sure you would have examples too of trying to create material spaces that will facilitate other ways for people to be together. So what has this meant for me and my practices? I think about this, well, now I want to come to the question of feeling bad now and or how are we feeling now. So this I just stuck in here, thinking about if I'd sent a photograph of recent demonstrations. So this is me on my way to the Women's March in January with sort of my version of pussy power going on, and on the other, this sign says Deep Les, bring on the queer witch magic, and then the back was chrome power. I got a lot of affirmation for I guess, trying to combat ageism by proudly declaring crone power. And as I was saying to some folks last night, I also was trying to work with slogans that invoked magic, because I was feeling, and I think I still feel this way, that it's, we need to summon all the powers that we have, and so it may be that it's going to require magic to affect any kind of change. So in addition to going to demonstrations, I've also been dealing with various kinds of fallout on my campus from both national and state level politics. Just while I've been away here, Confederate statues have been removed on my campus, which I was very happy to see. I think it's partly enabled by the fact that this statue of Jefferson Davis was already removed a year ago. And so it's interesting to see this now very public national discussion about statues, Confederacy, and so on taking place on my campus. I'm very happy that the university president did make this decision actually very quickly and without consultation. Interesting, given that he has been not so good on the question of legislation that has made it legal to carry concealed weapons on our campus. It's like only in America. And the institution has been unbudging in response to calls by really the majority of the university community, both faculty, students, and staff, to push back. So this is actually the windows of my office. A lot of us have been displaying these signs that say gun-free UT. And we have been, this is our beautiful campus with the pool. And then if you look, very, very closely, you can see these signs that say gun-free UT. A group of us, identified as dissidents, were called into the administration office and told that we needed to take these signs down, that there had been complaints, that it was illegal because various kinds of graffiti are illegal, and we said no. And especially, I hope my photos suggest that it's not as though it's like defacing the campus to have these forms of public expression in our windows. We were also using, I think, increasingly little power we have as faculty to be able to use the space of our offices in a kind of semi-autonomous way to put these signs up. It would be something that many staff members would not feel comfortable doing, would feel like their jobs might be in jeopardy. So, to some extent, we're using the protection of tenure to be able to manifest in this way. And so far, we have not had to take them down. But we also have to, we've kind of played with signage in, we are allowed to ask that students not bring guns into our offices, but we're not allowed to put up a sign that says that. We have to so this is kind of interesting in terms of performative politics, right? And also who's in control of who. So we have to verbally ask students not to bring a gun or each time a student comes into our office. So there's this little, drama at the threshold. So people have come up with various ways to signify this by putting these signs on their office doors. There's my door with my book. And then, there have been demonstrations, of course. I was also going to do just a little performance. I'm doing a reenactment of one of our first demonstrations. Where did I put it? Oh, this was what I brought to the demonstration. I told some of you about this. I just wrote "scared professor" in really bad, just like I made this sign in 2 seconds before I showed up at the demonstration, and it did actually draw a lot of media attention. They're like, what's that? Let's interview you. But it was an effort to kind of perform vulnerability as opposed to a kind of, expertise or vigilant anti-gun statement. And a lot of us I'm not denigrating that form of public expression. It's very effective at demonstrations, but I wanted to bring public feelings into the mix and to say, yes, I may be a professor, yes, I may have, facts and figures about what's terrible about gun use in the United States, but I also want to just start from the fact that I am a scared professor. Okay. I'm winding up here. That was my ranking. Okay. So we've done some writing together at UT as well, particularly in the wake of the election. And I wanted to close by just reading a piece that that kind of came out of that work of trying to bring people together to describe, how we are feeling now. Are we scared? Are we politically depressed? I will say, I think a lot of people are feeling both edgy and overwhelmed. So rather than a kind of depression of I don't know what to do, it's kind of there are so many things to do. We have bathroom politics, we have campus carry, we have immigration, we have, just the list goes on of places, anti-racism, places where I have been trying to put my attention just in the last year, and it is quite overwhelming. Also trying to think about affect in this context. in the wake of the election led me to write this piece called White Women's Tears. So I'm just going to read it. I can't bear to see another white woman cry. So says a close friend, echoing what I've heard from other people of color, directly and indirectly, as in the wake of the election, I try to do the public feelings work of asking people, both individually and in groups, how they are feeling. No, really, I mean it. How are you feeling? I ask, hoping to build some sense of what's going on from the varied responses of my circle of queers, immigrants, academics, artists. Or not build, not try to come to any grand conclusions at this early stage, but just sit with the immediate responses and contradictions jostling alongside one another. People of color are angry that white people failed them, and they bring out the statistics to back it up. Sharon wants a t-shirt that says 94% of black women voted for Hillary. Someone else points out that even if 33% of Latinos went the other way, a significant majority voted Democratic. So what about the 53% of white women who voted for Trump? Is that why the ones who didn't are crying? I cried, and in public too, the day after the election during our weekly meditation gathering to protest the campus carry legislation that makes guns legal on our campus. Only after we had meditated together could I feel it enough to cry rather than stay numb. I didn't care who saw me. In an effort to get some traction on the problem of white women's tears, I bring it up at one of my public feelings gatherings and end up hurting the feelings of my dear white woman friend who has been crying. Oh no, that's not what I meant. I'm just wondering if we're going to be able to stay in the room together, to be able to stand hearing people of color say they are mad at or disappointed by white people, to let white people have their states of shock and grief, to give space to the people of white working class origins for whom the blanket attacks on people like them are hard to take, to listen to immigrants of various origins grappling with what it means to live in the US. Are the lessons of political depression any different now than they were after 9/11 or in the Bush era, or even for that matter during the Obama presidency, where there were plenty of disappointments from healthcare to climate change to Syria to Guantanamo to Standing Rock to dead black bodies on the streets? Always the dialectic of hope and despair must be negotiated without any predictable formula. The tools of survival and resilience mustered from within the experience of struggle. I've been getting inquiries from around the world. A publisher in Turkey is interested in translating my book because it would be relevant to the political situation there. A journalist in Egypt asks me questions for a story about how to survive a failed revolution. And an artist friend in Sweden just emailed this morning to say that she is making a poster that features a line I wrote for an art installation called The Alphabet of Feeling Bad. In my utopia, there will be plenty of room for bad feelings, is the line she takes. The category of political depression continues to resonate, but people are struggling with the idea that dwelling in depression can be productive. I'm not sure I meant that exactly, only that we had to acknowledge depression, despair, hopelessness, and be willing to feel it as part of the political process. Let the tears fall where they may. If white women need to cry, we should cry, although it's not the responsibility of women of color to take care of us. I want to think about the shape of feelings, about not just sadness and anger, but other vocabularies. Here's where I'll just put Claudia Rankine, who's come up in our discussions also here. In the creative nonfiction I've been reading and teaching, what I call, borrowing from W.E.B. Du Bois, the affective color line manifests as the wound versus the weight. In the feminist literature, suffering, especially sexual assault, is wound, puncture, penetration, trauma, drawing from the model of Christian sacrifice. For Gloria Anzaldúa, the border is una herida abierta, an open wound, although claiming the borderlands for queers and immigrants, the atravesados, suggests that a wound can be an opening. But in Claudia Rankine's lyric essay Citizen, the experience of everyday racism that is now getting shorthanded as microaggression is a weight, baggage that gets piled on and carried around in a body that drags and sags. I'm feeling the wound and the weight. Sometimes I cry, sometimes I sigh. I think I will stop there.